Good evening. Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. Thank you to the Hank Centre and to Mark Bosco for your generosity in hosting me. And thank you particularly to Jacob and to Colby in their generosity in inviting me here and making everything go as smoothly as it possibly could. I very much appreciate that. The work that I'm going to introduce to you tonight is really work that I'm planning to do a little bit further down the track in my sabbatical in semester 2 of this year. But when Colby contacted me and spoke to me about the theme of the conference, it seemed to me that it would be a shame not to at least begin the explorations that I have so long been wanting to do around the work of St. Ignatius Loyola in relation to questions around revelation. So thank you for the opportunity. I haven't gone as far as I would like to go. If I was here in 12 months' time, you might get quite a different paper. But for now, let's see. The enduring legacy of St. Ignatius Loyola is that he experienced the passing of God in his everyday life and showed the way for others to discern this passage and live accordingly. This extraordinary understanding of the possibility of a truly personal relationship with God is a beacon of hope for the ordinary person who, not drawn to contemplative commitment, still longs to be caught up in the love that is promised as the meaning and dynamism of Christian existence. Moreover, it affirms unequivocally the value of the secular, not as that to be defined negatively against what is apparently sacred, but as the locus of God's care and concern and the sphere of God's activity. In 1956, Karl Rahner argued that the spiritual exercises were deserving of greater theological consideration, and it is my view that this is still the case, not least in terms of their theological recontextualisation for today. This is particularly so with regard to the question of revelation, or more precisely, with regard to the more general problem of the gap between religious experience as it is construed within the framework of spiritual reflection and revelation as it is articulated theologically. This question assumes a particular urgency from the contemporary context in which we find ourselves. In an academic context, to speak of revelation is frequently to exclude oneself immediately from the possibility of serious philosophical or other conversation. And in many Western cultural contexts, and Australia is one of them, the idea of belief in God on the basis of revelation is frequently greeted with incredulity. To put the issue plainly, what is needed is a way of thinking about revelation which permits some kind of credible dialogue about it to take place within contemporary thought and culture. My argument here is that recent developments within French phenomenology allow for this kind of dialogue, and that Ignatius's spiritual exercises are a useful lens through which this can both be illustrated and explored further in the experience of everyday life. There are good reasons to reinforce the distinction between religious experience and revelation. After all, as Jean-Yves Lacoste observes, experience is not self-evidently a theological datum, and we are wise to be cautious in our readings of religious experience. Moreover, when in the Christian Church we understand all revelation to have its apex in the incarnation of God's Word in the person of Jesus Christ, the Word who speaks everything of God, so that we understand everything before or since to be the unfolding of what has already been spoken. We commit ourselves to the echoing or recognition of that word in our experience, rather than to the possibility of a novel experience of revelation as such. Nevertheless, if we are to take Dei Verbum seriously and to believe that revelation is always God's self-revelation, then we must understand revelation in relational terms, and relationships depend on personal experience. We might consider much of the contemporary emphasis on personal experience to be misplaced, but we will have missed something essential to Christian faith if we do not appreciate that unless God speaks to us in the depths of experience, we will not have tasted God's love. And if we do not taste this love, there will be no reason at all to pursue it. It is not enough that I hear God's word spoken in general terms. I must hear it addressed to me directly. And that requires not only the repetition of the charisma, but also and especially that word speaking in the specific circumstances and shape of my own life. God speaking to me. One of the key difficulties we encounter when we try to speak about revelation is to think through its actual character. While Christians believe that God wants to communicate with humanity and has so communicated, particularly in the history of the Jewish and Christian traditions, the disjunction between the divine and the human poses particular difficulties for the whole notion of something like revelation. It is easy to repeat the biblical injunction that for God all things are possible, even if they're not possible for human beings. Yet this can mean that we do not take sufficiently seriously our human context and the fact that God does not appear as such within it. Avery Dulles' now classic systematization of revelatory models and his exploration of revelation as symbolic mediation have been very important. Nevertheless, he's expressed anxieties about the possibility of, I quote, an ecstatic encounter with God that has no explicitly doctrinal content, end quote, actually go to the heart of the issue. It is difficult to link revelation and experience. Theologically, because it is often considered that there is ultimately too much at stake in doctrine for revelation to be considered as a genuinely personal encounter. And philosophically, because we simply cannot think God according to the manner of beings or even of being itself. It is for this reason that the work of our very eminent co-presenter, Professor Jean-Luc Marion, is so important. By seeking to give a phenomenological account of revelation, he highlights, both theologically and philosophically, the nature of experience, and opens a way forward for thinking revelation that is neither solipsistic nor excluded in principle from academic discourse. You will forgive me for being very brief in this characterisation, and Professor Marion, I ask you to be particularly forgiving of my characterisation. Marion argues that philosophy relies on the principle of sufficient reason to determine in advance what kinds of phenomena are possible to consider. This approach excludes revelatory phenomena. In contrast, by means of a thinking based on a phenomenological reduction to givenness, that is, working on the principle that there is no principle that should exclude whatever gives itself to consciousness, Marion maintains that revelatory phenomena can be given in their possibility. Their actuality as revelatory is a matter, however, for theology to discern. Marion relies for this argument on his development of the concept of the saturated phenomenon, where what is given to consciousness in intuition is so excessive that any attempt to meet it with a corresponding intention can only fail, or at best, signify varying completely. In his more recent work, he'll speak of this as a negative certainty. Revelation is a special type of saturated phenomenon because it incorporates each of 4 other types he has identified. The event, which saturates by its quality, that is, by being unforeseeable and unrepeatable. The idol, which saturates by its quantity, that is, by its excessive visibility. Flesh, which saturates by relation, because it is absolute. And the icon, which saturates by modality, being resistant to all constitution. As Marion writes, and I quote, "What is experienced in Revelation can be summed up as the powerlessness to experience whatever it might be that one experiences." Let us try to give an example of such a phenomenon from a biblical text. The story of the woman with the hemorrhage, which I take from Luke's Gospel, and I apologise that I don't have, this is the middle of the sandwich. I've omitted the story of Jairus' daughter around it, really for sake of time tonight, but it truly belongs there. And so I read, "Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. And though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. She came up behind Jesus and touched the fringe of his clothes, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Then Jesus asked, 'Who touched me?' When all denied it, Peter said, 'Master, the crowds surround you and press upon you.' But Jesus said, 'Someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out of me.' When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace.'" Now, when we contemplate this scene, what is given to us? First, we see a woman, but we see her only as she tries to remain hidden. Nameless throughout the narrative, the woman's illness makes her repellent. Even if we cannot yet see the inevitable stain of her disease on her clothes, we are given its characteristic smell. And the stigma of her uncleanliness hangs like a pall around her. While she apparently believes that Jesus can heal her, she evidently feels she can only approach him anonymously. Jostling in the crowd, her stench undoubtedly competes with all the surrounding smells of an ancient town, and she stands a chance of momentarily disguising her approach. Her healing reportedly takes place as soon as she touches the fringe of Jesus' clothes. The Jesus we are given in this narrative is characterised by strangeness. The description of his feeling power having gone out from him is just plain odd to the modern ear, and appears even stranger as his evident powerfulness contrasts with his apparent lack of awareness of who has touched him. If we've been educated to any degree about Jesus' context in ancient Palestine, we might see him in terms of a culture where wonder workers are relatively commonplace. But his complete otherness to the contemporary mind makes him resistant to our gaze. Jesus' question, however, brings him sharply into personal focus. Who touched me? Not only the woman and the others in the crowd, but also we, the hearers of the narrative, are brought into the sphere of his address. Peter's response is logical, but dismissive. Jesus' insistence on the point, "Someone touched me," begins to draw he and the woman together in a different way. her givenness in the narrative is altered at this stage. The woman comes into full view, and her selfhood erupts in her testimony. She came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. In responding to Jesus, she herself becomes visible as one who confesses and thus brings to manifestation Jesus' power to heal. At this point, we also see Jesus himself more clearly as a person, as he addresses her not only with authority, but also with tenderness and compassion. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Yet with these words, Jesus declines the identity of a healer or wonder worker. He ascribes the healing to her faith, and in doing so, invites our further questioning about his identity. In almost the same moment, both she and we are gently dismissed from him. Go in peace. We can use Marion's categories, themselves inversions of Kant's categories with regard to the possibility of experience, to analyse the narrative. Doubtlessly, it takes place as an event. We are unable to give an adequate account of its quantity or dimensions. It is unforeseeable, not exhaustively comprehensible, and not reproducible. In terms of quality, the scene functions technically as an idol. There is too much to see, which means that what we see of it is always too little. In terms of relation, we're not able to determine a reason or a cause for what has happened to the woman and Jesus' part in it. We cannot explain it in terms of causality. We see neither the healing nor Jesus' divinity as such. So we are left with a question then, which is whether or not to trust this woman, to believe her. Is this a revelatory text? Am I, are you addressed by it now? In proposing an example of a saturated phenomenon, I selected something biblical to make my way forward a little simpler. By asking about the personal resonances of the text, I sought to link it with contemporary experience. But I drew from the canon, which is kind of cheating because it's considered to be revelatory. And any personal experiences there were or are could be considered revelatory in a secondary or derivative sense. In my notes I refer to John Macquarie here, who talks about the way in which we have that kind of secondary or repetitive experience of revelation. It is indeed possible to encounter Jesus in a prayerful reading of a text. But what I mean to get at this evening is a thinking of revelation that enables this aspect of personal encounter to be interrogated more fully. Marion gives us very powerful descriptions of how the saturated phenomenon gives itself to experience. When I refer to experience, of course, I do not mean that the saturated phenomenon is reducible to the Husserlian Erlebnis or lived experience of consciousness. Instead, the recipient or gifted one, which I usually leave translated as la donnée, receives what runs counter to experience. And this gifted one resists it, and resists is in inverted commas here, resists it in such a way that he or she brings the saturated phenomenon to light. As Marion says, and I quote, "The receiver, in and through the receptivity of feeling, transforms givenness into manifestation." The given impresses itself on the receiver without appearing as an object to be constituted theoretically. It is the effect or feeling of the given that is primary. He specifies that feeling does not result from the thing as its effect or double as its appearance, but shows it as its one and only possible apparition. End quote. In other words, the effect is the appearance. Yet this apparition or manifestation is at the same time hidden from the gaze, that is, hidden from object constitution. To quote Marion again, this presentation implies reception in feeling, and it aims precisely at showing for thought, manifesting for a consciousness, forming for vision what otherwise would give itself to the blind. End quote. Not only does la donnée make the given visible in this transmutation, but the very act of transmutation makes la donnée, him or herself, visible. This provokes, as he says, a double visibility, which happens in the response made by la donnée to the given. We can also call it the call in the sense of the call and response, and the making visible of la donnée in the process. I turn now to examine very briefly an important contribution to this discussion that can be drawn from the work of Jean-Yves Lacoste. In La Phénoménalité de Dieu, Lacoste observes that if we are to know God, it will be in the domain of affection. God can appear, he writes, not in theophany, but in the modest form of a presence felt. By presence, Lacoste cannot mean the coincidence of meaning and being, since he has just, in that text, described phenomenologically the experience of a knowing that is always dependent on the memory or the anticipation of what is not present. Moreover, he is at pains to point out that an effective knowledge does not imply an understanding that grasps the totality, but instead is knowledge by means of acquaintance or recognition. And I read from him here. The fact that the heart can sense God's absence and presence at the same time is the cornerstone of all interpretation of so-called religious experiences. God is not felt more than he is unfelt. To know that he eludes the always possible domination of feeling is to respect his transcendence. Anticipations of his eschatological presence, that is to say, of his parousia, can certainly be conceded to privileged witnesses. But in the everyday context to which our experience of God, or quasi-experience, belongs, we should be satisfied with a radically non-eschatological presence. That God is known by means of the affect makes sense of the belief that God is known as love. As Lacoste tells us, only if we perceive God as lovable can we perceive God at all. While Lacoste allows the possibility that God is felt as event in experience and so draws us in love, in much of his work, and more commonly, we find ourselves dealing with the situation where God does not seem present to the believer at all. This is exemplified in his discussion of the Eucharist. Having underscored the importance of the affect in recognising the event, Lacoste explains that in the Eucharistic event, one might not feel anything, save the feeling that one does not feel, which he calls a wound of experience. Lacoste argues, however, that not feeling is itself a way of feeling, which occurs where belief, quote, is accompanied by an I feel that I do not feel, or perhaps by a sense that what I do not feel could, and hypothetically should, be felt. This felt lack is particularly so in view of those words and acts accompanying the Eucharistic elements, which recall, as he says, the exact nature of the gift. In the celebration of the Eucharist, the spoken words authoritatively name what is given, the Eucharistic gift. Yet this is not a phenomenon that is perceived with the senses, even if reference to it is made in the phenomena of the sacramental things. What is felt then is the gap between the phenomenon of the given and the phenomenon of the sacramental gift, an experience of non-experience, which I think we can distinguish from Marion's counter-experience. Joris Schrevers explains the double nature of this non-experience, and I quote, "On the one hand, I experience my non-experience through experiencing a certain lack. And on the other, I experience that which is lacking from this non-experience. I experience a lack of experience and that which is lacking from experience. In other words, I experience simultaneously that God does not come to experience, and I experience that what I am experiencing is not God." Now, something that I find interesting about this is that at this point, believer and non-believer alike would appear to have the same experience. Which is to say, an experience whereby there is no ready assurance of God's presence, and where that gap in experience is open to interpretation. To sum up my very brief sketch of the understandings of Marion and Lacoste in relation to a thinking of revelation, both allow that God gives God's self to be felt in experience. For Marion, that felt givenness can be transmuted into a showing by means of the recipient, although it will never be expressed exhaustively. For Lacoste, while it may be that God is felt as present, for most believers, this will be what he calls a radically non-eschatological presence, rather than an anticipation of eschatological presence. More often than not, we will experience the non-experience of God, and we will be left to discern whether this is an experience of the holy or whether we're simply being deceived by the sacred. We turn now, and perhaps you might be thinking, at last, to consider the possible contribution of the spiritual exercises to a rethinking of revelation along these lines. Ignatius, as you all undoubtedly know, is a great believer in the value of examining experience, particularly as feelings emerge in the course of that experience. In this process of examination, he believes not only that it is possible to know God's will, but also that what we come to know in discerning God's will is God. However, if we are to undertake the discernment process authentically, we must put our own interests completely aside, with the development of a personal quality that Ignatius describes as indifference. He looks carefully at what is given, in its very givenness, without any pre-commitment as to its origins or meaning. Any judgment about its divine quality is delayed until what appears in feeling has been examined, especially in light of context, earlier factors, or later responses. In this way, we might consider Ignatius a proto-phenomenologist. Two sections of the exercises are immediately relevant to the question of how God communicates with us. The three ways of making a choice of a way of life, commonly known as the election, and the rules for the discernment of spirits. Many will be familiar with the three modes of election. To summarise, the first experience of election occurs, and I quote, "when God our Lord so moves and attracts the will that a devout soul, without hesitation or the possibility of hesitation, follows what has been manifested to it." In the second mode, the choice is arrived at because, quote, "much light and understanding are derived through experiences of desolations and consolations and discernment of diverse spirits." Finally, when the soul is in a state of what Ignatius calls tranquility, other means of arriving at a determination are needed, such as weighing up the pros and cons of the situation. While all three modes are relevant, it is the first mode that is of special interest to us now. What does Ignatius mean by the first mode? As many have said before me, the text is unhelpfully brief and in many ways equivocal. It is not clear, for example, whether what has been made manifest is the Lord so moving and attracting the will, or some further revelation specific to the course of action. Karl Rahner and other commentators, such as Jules Toner, agree that it is a matter of the communication of God's will within the will of the person, as he or she is drawn to something specific. Many commentators make much of the self-authenticating nature of this mode of election. However, Toner believes that it must be subject to further critical examination, that is through the second way, in order to be confirmed. In this way, Toner actually views the three modes of election as one, or of a piece. Rahner also sees the three modes as inherently connected, but unlike Toner, sees the first mode as the basis for the other two, providing the ultimate standard for all discernment. He also views the first mode, and I quote, as a divine revelation, whether it belongs to public revelation or is a private revelation. In contrast, Dulles claims that it is a private revelation, underscoring its rarity with reference to its occurrence in the lives of the great saints. And this reminds us that for Dulles, experience of God as the ineffable is really the prerogative of the mystics and not of the everyday believer. While it is revelatory in character, the first mode of election is not beatific. The working of God that Ignatius describes is in the will, although Rahner maintains that this too is a type of knowledge. Now, Toner distinguishes firmly between the will and the affect, defining this aspect of the first mode as, quote, a volitional tendency towards something to be done, a conative act of will. While in parenthesis, emphasises that, again I quote, it is not a feeling of consolation in the affective sensibility, and stresses that not a word is said about spiritual consolation. This is written, I think, in an attempt to make clear his disagreement with Rahner, who reads the whole notion of election in light of the rules for the discernment of spirits, and so interprets the first mode in terms of the experience of God's intimacy offered in the Consolation without previous cause, or CSCP, against which it can be tested in terms of its consolatory quality, origins, and indubitability. Ignatius describes the CSCP in paragraph 330, and I'll just refresh your memories. God alone, he says, can give consolation to the soul without any previous cause. It belongs solely to the Creator to come into a soul, to leave it, to act upon it, to draw it wholly into the love of his divine majesty. I said without previous cause, that is, without any preceding perception or knowledge by which a soul might be led to such a consolation through his own acts of intellect and will. To understand what is meant by the CSCP, we must first gain some appreciation of what Ignatius means by consolation. In paragraph 316, he states, I name it consolation when some inner motion is prompted in the person, of such a kind that he begins to be aflame with love of his Creator and Lord, and consequently, when he cannot love any created thing on the face of the earth in itself, but only in the Creator of them all. He specifies further, consolation can come in love that moves to the expression of tears over sin, in that very 16th century style, or Christ's passion, or something else ordered to the praise and service of God. It is also, quote, every increase of hope, faith, or charity, and every inward gladness. So what we have with spiritual consolation is a wide range of effective responses. It can come from God or from elsewhere. When consolation is God-given, for Ignatius, it is distinguished by the intense love felt at its base and by having God as its sole aim. Spiritual desolation, in contrast, which never comes from God, is understood by Ignatius as the soul's feeling of being, quote, separated, as it were, from its Creator and Lord. Without entering more fully into the debate between Rana and Toner, and it's quite a long debate, we might ask whether it is nevertheless possible that feelings of consolation might pertain to the first mode of election. While Toner is right that Ignatius does not mention consolation in this instance, in the immediacy of God's movement and attraction in the will, it is hard to imagine that this could be undergone otherwise than as a moment of consolation. For the soul that is open and drawn to the love of God, God's nearness would necessarily be felt as welcome. This enables us to reconcile, more fully than Toner, I think, is able to do, both first-time election and the CSCP, by means of the oft-quoted passage from Ignatius's letter to Teresa Rajado. And I quote, "It often happens that our Lord moves and forces us interiorly to one action or another by opening up our mind and heart, that is, speaking inside us without any noise of voices, raising us entirely to his divine love, without our being able to resist his purpose, even if we wanted." In this letter, we find a fuller description by Ignatius of the nature of the experience of God's self-revelation in personal intimacy, opening up mind and heart, speaking without noise, raising into love, communicating an irresistible purpose. Extremely difficult to determine is what Ignatius means by without previous cause. Harvey Egan suggests that the phrase should be placed in the context of the whole exercises, to mean that it relates to grace not previously asked for when you're making the exercises. However, if it is to be argued that spiritual discernment is not an activity strictly limited to exercitants, in other words, if it is really possible to find God in all things, and not to limit God's self-giving in grace to those choosing a way of life, then it is hard to maintain that the CSCP should only be seen as occurring within the meditations, prayers, and disciplines of the spiritual exercises. Moreover, it seems strange that an exercitant should have set a limit on what he or she expects from any given meditation. I am thus inclined to take Ignatius's words at face value here to suggest that previous cause refers to the capacity of the person to have produced the intense consolation that is given in this situation. We could agree with Egan that without previous cause means out of all proportion with what has gone before, without limiting that to a specific request for grace. And I agree with Rana and others that the disjunction between the capacity of the person to be led to such a consolation through his own acts of intellect and will and the experience of the consolation can be read in terms of an experience that has content but no conceptual object. Rana theorises that in the CSCP, an object of consciousness fades to reveal the ground of subjectivity, present to consciousness in a way similar to that in which consciousness for Rana is present to itself, which is to say, at once revealed as imageless or as mystery. Philip N. Dean draws our attention to the fact that in considering such an experience of God, Rana echoes the words of Bonaventure, and I quote, "And then, in truth, they feel rather than know." It is in their exploration of this feeling rather than knowing that Marion and Lacoste offer a rich way of thinking through the Ignatian experience. To rephrase my key question then, if revelation is authentically described in Christian tradition as, and here I'm quoting from Dave Verbum, the action of the invisible God who out of the abundance of love speaks to us as friends, then how does this communication take place? It seems to me that God's givenness to the individual, as Ignatius describes it, can readily be framed in terms of the saturated phenomenon, particularly insofar as it is experienced as a felt pressure, the communication of which transmutes an altogether excessive intuition into an intentional showing. We can describe this using the various typologies of saturation. Revelation happens as an event, quite literally without previous cause. As an idol, in this circumstance, it's not so much that there is literally too much to see, but that any concept ascribed to what is given will be inadequate. It's flesh. It happens internally to me, and while there remains in principle a distinction between self and God, such a distinction cannot be felt, since I am feeling the felt without any sense of its being exterior to me. It is absolute. And it is given as icon. There is nothing to see. I am present to God rather than God present to me beatifically. Needless to say, in the transmutation of the saturated phenomenon into words and other symbols of revelation, we recognise a hermeneutic act that takes place in the context of a specific religious tradition and is tested and should be tested by the community of that tradition. If we use Lacoste's language instead of Marion's, we could describe the Ignatian experience in terms of non-eschatological presence, a felt presence that is a kind of knowledge in terms of acquaintance or recognition rather than a concept. We can see here a helpful way of thinking about the tension between revelation as once and for all and revelation as meaningful self-revelation to the individual. In revelation, as it unfolds personally, I recognise the God who approaches me as the God of the tradition, while coming to know that God in a uniquely interpersonal way. There are a number of other aspects of Ignatius's work that could very readily be explored in this respect, and I'm regretful that time does not permit us to do so here. These include the question of what relationship, if any, Lacoste's experience of non-experience bears to the Ignatian understanding of consolation and desolation. The process of Ignatian discernment with respect to establishing the authenticity of any consolatory experience. And thinking through parameters for the legitimate role of the imagination in phenomenological meditation on Scripture or the experience of prayer. Moreover, while we've only just begun to translate the Ignatian experience of God's self-revelation in terms we might use within the Academy, we have not yet considered if there is more that we can say in relation to meaningful dialogue within contemporary culture. The Ignatian search for God in all things has an ongoing relevance with regard to the recent cultural emphasis on personal experience. This is even more the case as it relates to individual feelings, especially if these can be sensitised in critical and reflective ways. But it is made more complex by the question of the extent to which we take seriously that our context today is not one where Christian faith can simply be projected onto a range of human experiences in an attempt to preempt their fullest meaning. A great challenge, in other words, will be to live out the Ignatian search in genuine dialogue with people who begin their searching from a different place. But all this opens onto much more than I can say here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Horner. Responding to this address is Dr. Michelle Molina, the John and Rosemary Croghan Chair and Associate Professor in Catholic Studies at Northwestern University. Dr. Molina is the perfect respondent as she studies the Society of Jesus in the early modern period, exploring Jesuit spirituality in an effort to understand how individuals approached and experienced religious transformation. In particular, she has been interested in examining the impact of the Ignatian spiritual exercises on early modern global expansion. She is the author of To Overcome Oneself, the Jesuit Ethic and Spirit of Global Expansion, 1520 to 1767, published by University of California Press in 2013. Please help me welcome Dr. Molina to make a response.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. Thank you for the wonderful opening lecture in what's already proving to be a very nice conference. I attended a few of the papers this afternoon. I have scribbles all over my paper, so if I stumble. But Dr. Horner closes with this compelling thought. In fact, more than a thought, she phrases this as a challenge and an opening to further discussion. What is it to, quote, live out the Ignatian search in genuine dialogue with people who begin their searching from a different place? In other words, what is revelation? How to speak about it? These all seem to be really important aspects of her paper today. How to have a credible dialogue, given contemporary thought, given our contemporary cultures, in a world both inside and outside of the academy where shared assumptions about religion can be few. As she's explained, Dr. Horner wants to get at revelation as a saturated phenomenon, but this depends upon that problematic category, religious experience. Revelation then comes to us through personal experience and is mediated by a hermeneutic act that entails, as she says, the transmutation of the saturated phenomenon into words and other symbols of revelation, and these are expressed within the context of a tradition. They are tested. I would add that they're judged by community. So how do we access this experience? How do we have a conversation about it, a cross-disciplinary conversation, possibly trans-academic conversation, a cross-cultural conversation? All of these seem to be what is at stake in the presentation that Dr. Horner gave us today. Now, between theology and philosophy, I step in as a historian, a bit of an interloper here. Welcome, myself. Now here's where Dr. Horner is a theologian and myself a historian of religion have something in common. It's that religious experience poses such a particular challenge. To get anywhere near revelation, she has to account for the personal experience of being touched, gifted, consoled by God. And similarly, in my own efforts to understand religious experience historically, I studied Catholics in the early modern European and colonial Spanish-American world. I engaged these very texts that were born of hermeneutic acts, these hermeneutic acts of sense-making. And just to be brief, the sources that I use range from guides to making the spiritual exercises. This was a small industry among early modern Jesuits. To understand Ignatian, I'm doing this to understand Ignatian spirituality in, of course, a historical context. And I also use things like spiritual diaries when it's possible to get them, some letters about making the exercises, or letters that reveal how one has discerned precisely what is God's will in one's own life after making the exercises. So, for example, many Jesuits will write letters after making the exercises claiming that they know precisely what God wants them to do. He wants them to go to China. And then the Father Provincial will shake his head and say, "You're headed to Mexico." Um, perhaps you're needed to stay in that small town in the mountains in Italy. And then there are the letters from between Ignatius and 16th century religious women who made the exercises and declared that it was God's will that they become Jesuits. Now, this was really resonating with me when you talked about the women with the hemorrhage, and do we trust her story? Do we believe her? Ignatius often shook his head no. He claimed that he had a better sense of God's will, and thus my emphasis on the fact that revelation and hermeneutics all take place in the context of often corrective community. And then, of course, the spiritual exercises themselves. That scissors and paste working guide, as John O'Malley dubbed them, were also the ongoing product of Ignatius's own note-taking, his own traces of his own hermeneutic acts. And I want to suggest that these are ongoing revelations, small and large. This project of tweaking and revisiting and so on, that was Ignatius's spiritual life, and that was taken up by Jesuits after him throughout the centuries, despite the fact that there was, in 1542, a fancy Latin translation and the need to name an autograph copy when there were so many of them. Which one is the autograph copy? That we needed to have one to sort of contain this constant process of exploration and new revelations with a small r. So what I want to say here is that whether searching for a better understanding of revelation, Robyn's aim, or the religious experience of 16th, 17th, and 18th century Catholics, that's my world, what we both want Ignatius' spiritual exercises to do, we both want Ignatius' spiritual exercises to do something for us, to show us something. And I think it's fair to say that Robyn and I, and now I've established some common ground here, so I've switched to your first name, Robyn, we share a similar problem. We are working with a text that provides an outline, but itself does not quite give us as many answers to the questions that we've set out for ourselves. As Robyn states, the exercises are, quote, unhelpfully brief, in many ways equivocal. There is a frustration for those who wish to categorize them. Yet I want to suggest that this is the beauty of the spiritual exercises. They are a process. One knows them not by reading them. This is the oft-stated analogy, that it would be folly to try to read the blueprint for building a train to understand what it might be to experience riding a train. So too, we don't know the exercises until we take them for a spin. Then we have, excuse me. So then we have a suggested answer to Robyn's question, how does this communication then, how does this revelation take place? And the answer then is, it's not through reading the exercises, it's through trying to access how they might be made. So consolation out of proportion to what has gone before may be the aim or the end game, trying to understand what that, the phenomenology of that experience is about. But so much has gone on in the spiritual exercises prior to that. There isn't a fast track to any kind of revelation. It's like doing sit-ups or sprints as part of a routine to run a marathon. So there's exercise after exercise, preparation, practice. And the aim is to become better at discerning. To know God, you have to overcome yourself. But to overcome self, you must know yourself, which entails forging a sense of a self that wasn't quite there before that moment. So self is a problem. And this was Ignatius' brilliance. He knew the nature of the problem he was dealing with. People, who, even Catholic Europeans, were beginning their searching from different places because they inhabited different roles. Jesuits, businessmen, young boys in the Jesuit schools, women, nuns, etc. And he was very clear that they all inhabited different kinds of bodies. And remember, some began their searching quite literally from different places, as Ignatius codified his exercises in the era of early modern global expansion, and though all not on Ignatius's mind, when he began to scribble down notes about his own methods for finding spiritual consolation, by the time that St. Francis Xavier traveled to Asia, the exercises were a crucial part of his toolkit. To accommodate Catholicism to people who began from different places. So we are meeting people where they live, and the exercises are good for this. Why? Well, because there are a lot of Ors in the exercises, O-R. Do this, or do that. Ignatius, for example, jotted down notes for people that might be like physically incapacitated or sick, but he also advised, well, even if you're robust, this is a quote, and in the right dispositions, change up the timetable in order better to find what one desires. Or if you aren't finding any consolation in a particular series of exercises, skip the midnight meditation, get some sleep, eat properly, know what you need to eat, spend longer on this week of the exercises, or shorter. You get the point, experimentation. What works for you? Ignatius had intense faith in God, but he also had conviction about engaging in a process that was adaptable, a process that continued to be mysterious, unfixed. Even if one had made the exercises many, many times, one had to begin again. So Robyn's key question, if revelation is authentically described in Christian tradition as the action of the invisible God, who out of abundance of love speaks to us as friends, then how does this communication take place? Can I get that glass of water? Sorry. Ignatius had an answer. After I drink this, I'll tell you. And in this answer, he did pay less attention to God than he did to humans. Humans with bodies. Humans with bodies anchored in a now, with past newly constructed in this present and the next present, in the series of individual nows of each meditation, even between the breaks, and even in the breaks between meditations. So all of this then was a process of readying for communication. The examples abound. There are notes about posture, sitting, kneeling, prostrate on the ground. Figure it out, he says. Avoid anxiety, avoid excessive anxiety, but find what works and settle in. And then at the end of the exercise, take a break, release your body. Quote, I shall either take a walk or sit down for a quarter of an hour while I'm considering how the contemplation or the meditation has gone. In an effort to embody the proper attitude, to pay attention then to light and dark. That is, for example, during the first week of the exercises, it's suggested, the first week is when you're focusing on your self as a sinner. Close the shutters, darken the room, avoid laughter, cover one's eyes. But in the fourth week, to better attain joy, open up the shutters, take in the light, feel the cooling breeze, or the heat of the fire, he suggests. Maybe it's winter after all. Maybe it's just a cold Chicago spring. But do whatever best allows one to rejoice at the resurrection. Again, at every step, evaluate. What gave consolation? Where was I lost in moments of desolation? In the process, don't negate the body, but better incorporate it. Be sensorially present in the meditations derived from the Gospels. Robyn brought out some of this today, her attention to sensorial aspects when bringing the stench of the hemorrhaging woman into the Gospel story. And so too were the exercitants to, through imagination, engage in a fully embodied sensorial experience of the life of Christ. I still think Roland Barthes offers some of the most astute observations about the interplay between the known and the unknown, critical to making the spiritual exercises. It highlights the human drama that is the desire for revelation. Quote, the retreatant cannot and must not know in advance anything about these series of experiments which are gradually being recommended to him. And this is why, at least initially, the practitioner does not read the text of the spiritual exercises. Quote, he is in the situation of a reader of a narrative who's kept in suspense, a suspense which vitally concerns him, since he is also an actor in the story, whose elements are gradually given to him. So accordingly, the focus on banal activity also functions, Barthes goes on to tell us, to combat feelings of vagueness and emptiness. And it organizes all of the insignificant details of this daily meditations to contribute to the development of a kind of a rhythmic language that's internal to the exercises. Quote, this is a longer quote, thus the temporal needs from which one cannot escape, light, the weather outside, food, dress, these must be made profitable in order that they may be turned into image objects. During meals, here he's quoting the spiritual exercises. This is advice from Ignatius about how one ought to imitate Christ. During meals, consider Christ our Lord. as though one saw him eating with his disciples, his way of drinking, of looking, of speaking. Try to imitate him. And these all follow a totalitarian economy in which everything, from the accidental to the futile and trivial, must be utilized. Like the novelist, the exercitant is someone for whom nothing is lost. So this sensorially rich yet blind approach to the divine could provoke intense anxiety, and Ignatius will constantly say, shake it off, take a walk, avoid that unproductive cliff of anxiety, sit back, take a few notes, and start again. So given Jesuit insistence on making oneself entirely indifferent to what might occur, combined with this Jesuit attention to how changing context could inform one's spiritual life, even exercitants repeating the spiritual exercises would be instructed to adapt an attitude of blind anticipation, perhaps even more attuned what might happen this next time. In many ways, I think it's a program of affect management. If the aim is indifference, and what I'm driving at here is if the aim of the exercitant is to reach some form of indifference, Ignatius himself was in no way indifferent to the embodied human experience. So, and finally, the spiritual exercises offered other modes of praying, from meditating on a single word to rhythmically breathing between words, drawing upon centuries of monastic tradition. The Jesuits experimented with ways of crafting thoughts about God, and Ignatius patched these together in a process for finding consolation, both in the exercises and, as Robyn tells us, that's so important, in finding God in all things, in everyday life, beyond the walls of the retreat house. As I've mentioned, I've said all this to give the audience a sense of the great attention paid to human embodied experience and embodied existence in the Ignatian spiritual exercises, and to find ways to recenter living people, in my case, dead people who were once living, into the phenomenology of religion. And what I've learned in the afternoon sessions is that everyone has a pet French phenomenologist. Mine is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, whose work on embodied intentionality could additionally and profitably be engaged to trace the emergence of consolation as anchored in embodied perception, the embodied experience that was so critically attended to by Ignatius when he wrote the spiritual exercises. And finally, just to close here on a small point, I would love to hear Robyn discuss spiritual consolation further. And here I ask whether, if leaning more heavily on the term consolation, as opaque as it may be, as opaque and elastic as it may be, might yet further the project that you seem to have in mind, where you closed your paper. That is the ethical need to meet humans where they stand. As humans who often quite find themselves more willing to engage on the ground of a perceived need for consolation than a perceived need for revelation. Thank you very much.